All right, good evening again, and welcome to Old South Meeting House. My name is Jamie Brody, and I'm the Education Director here at Old South. I'm pleased that you could join us tonight for the first in our series, Milestones in Public Care, the 200th anniversary of Massachusetts General Hospital. This event was generously funded by the Lowell Institute. Founded in 1811, Massachusetts General Hospital is one of Boston's most venerable institutions with an astonishing breadth of medical innovations. Two recent projects commemorate the 200th anniversary of this hospital. Tonight, we will be discussing the creation of the Paul S. Russell Museum of Medical History and Innovation with the museum director, Peter Johnson, and the book Something in the Ether, A Bicentennial History of Massachusetts General Hospital with author Webster Bull. Please join me in welcoming Peter Johnson.
Thank you. Good evening. I want to make sure my microphone is on. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm very honored to speak to you tonight, and I want to tell you that I'll speak first, and then as I'm up here, and then Webster will follow me. And we both have worked on important projects for the hospital's celebration of its 200th anniversary, as Jamie told you, and I am the director of the museum, and Webster wrote a new history of the hospital. And so we have worked together off and on through this year as we both developed our projects because they are, of course, related. So I'm going to tell you more about the hospital itself, a little bit about the history and why the hospital decided to build a museum and what we are going to make of this institution, because in some ways this has really been creating or making a new kind of institution. There are very few hospitals that have anything like a museum, actually. There are some medical schools that have small ones, but the only other hospital that I know of that has a museum is the Mayo Clinic, and it has a quite different museum than we are developing. And I mean to say we because I'm only the front man, the messenger for the development of this museum, which has been a dream of many people for many years. And it started at least 15 years ago with a group of people who really wanted to establish a way for people in Boston and people who visit Boston to know more about this amazing institution. So I started work at Mass General about 18 months ago, and we are going to open this museum not to the public until early next year, but we will have some inaugural events in December because we wanted it to fit within the 200th anniversary of the origination of the hospital itself. So with that introduction, I'm going to start talking about the hospital and the museum, and I'll show you another picture in case you haven't seen it yet. Here it is on the corner of Cambridge Street and North Grove Street. North Grove Street is the street that all the ambulances turn up, so it is the main drive into the hospital itself. And you can see the white building, which is the kind of wedding cake tower, so that was a 1930s building. And then to its right is the Bullfinch building. You can see the dome of the Bullfinch building, which was the original building of the hospital. So the museum itself is really right on the edge of the campus, and it is in many ways going to be a gateway for the hospital. Of course, it helps here that it's the only colored model aspect of the model. Oops, that wasn't what I wanted to do. Let's see if I can, there. So before I talk about the museum, I want to tell you a little bit about the origin of the hospital itself. This is, of course, a map of Boston and shows, as you probably all know, that Boston is built on fill, or most of Boston is built on fill. So at the time the hospital was founded in 1810, it was really a rather small town. In fact, Boston was the fourth largest city in the United States at that point, behind New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. In 1810, the population of Boston was around 33,000 people. What was medical care like in 1810? Remember, this is only 25 years after, about 25 years after the United States became a country itself. So in many ways, this was on the frontier, and there were only 2 hospitals in all of the United States at that point. There was one in Philadelphia, and there was one in New York. So if there was no hospital, how did you get medical care? Well, if you were wealthy, doctors treated you in your home. They came and visited you, and you may realize that they didn't know a whole lot about the body at that point, so you were cared for, but you could say that the care was not very sophisticated. If you were poor, you probably got no care at all. Or if you got any care, it was at the almshouse. And there was an almshouse in Boston, as there were in many other cities, and the almshouse in Boston was on Leverett Street, which doesn't exist anymore, but if you know where Leverett Circle is, that is the part of the city where the almshouse was. Now that side of Beacon Hill, remember Beacon Hill had not really been developed yet as a residential area in 1810, but still that side of Beacon Hill was the bad side of town. That was where the rope walks were, that was where the prison was, that was where the almshouse was. It was the poor side of town, and for many years it had remained that. In fact, it was the back side of the hill, meaning it was for the poorer population of Boston. In any event, that's where you would receive care, but the care was not good, and this is an illustration from the later 19th century that suggests how bad the conditions would have been at an almshouse like that. Now, at that time, the Reverend John Bartlett was the director of the almshouse, and he tried the best he could, but he knew that this was not good enough, and he persuaded two young doctors who had just finished their medical training in Europe, and a lot of American doctors were trained in Europe at that point. He persuaded them that Boston should do something better for the poor people, particularly for the poor people of Boston. So he told them, or they knew about the hospitals in New York and Philadelphia, and I'm sure to an extent there was some sense of competition in this city at that point, that if New York and Philadelphia had hospitals, Boston ought to have a hospital. But the point of the hospital was to care for the indigent. And so they wrote a letter, the two physicians, Dr. James Jackson and John Collins Warren, to their wealthy friends. It's called the circular letter because it was a printed letter that was circulated among their friends. And they were proposing that the wealthy citizens of Boston help to establish a hospital, and that, in fact, this hospital was going to be to care for the poorest people in Boston. And the famous line from that letter, at least for us at Mass General, is when in distress, every man becomes our neighbor. Now, they do go on to say in that letter, and it's even worse for women. They were describing the terrible conditions for poor people, and they went on to say, and if you're a woman, it's even worse. And so they were saying, we need to do something about this, and what we propose is that we form a hospital here and that you help us by giving us contributions. So that letter went out in 1810. In 1811, the legislature authorized a corporation called Massachusetts General Hospital to found a hospital. And they gave them certain rights, including the right to sell life insurance, which was the first life insurance company in Massachusetts. It's now Mass Mutual. It's not connected to Mass General anymore, but that was one of the ways that they helped the hospital fund itself, because remember, it wasn't going to charge people. It wasn't going to charge many people for their care. So in 1811, they were granted a charter. Well, then the War of 1812 started, and they couldn't raise enough money to actually build the hospital. So there was a pause in the development of the hospital until about 1818, after the war was over. The trustees of the hospital at that point bought a pasture in Boston. I'll show you where that was. And this is what Boston looked like in about 1811. And here's a blow-up of that. And the hospital itself is where this, oops, no, I'm going to show you first where we are. This is Old South Meeting House. And now I'll show you where the hospital is, because it's sort of hard to find your way around this old city because it's changed quite a bit. So there was the pasture that they bought, again, on the back side of what was Beacon Hill. The State House was a building at this point, and notice it's very close to the water, because at that point the rest of the city had not yet been filled in. So it was a kind of waterfront site, actually, at that point. And that is where they built the hospital. And they hired Charles Bulfinch, who was probably the most famous, eminent architect in Boston, maybe in the United States at that point, or one of them. Of course, Thomas Jefferson is another one that everybody knows by now. But Bulfinch was hired. He'd done a good number of buildings in Boston, houses, the Tontine Crescent and the State House. And he designed the hospital after he went on a tour of New York and Philadelphia's hospitals and wrote reports to the trustees about what he thought should be different with the Mass General Hospital. He was called to Washington, though, because the architect of the Capitol was dismissed. So he was called to finish the Capitol in Washington. So the trustees at that point hired Alexander Paris, who finished the work on the hospital, although Bulfinch had already designed it. So here's a drawing of what that hospital looked like when it opened in 1823. It is still there. It's still used as a vital part of the hospital itself, although there are no patients in the Bulfinch building anymore. But this is where everything happened. So this is where some of the head doctor lived, this is where the food was cooked, this is where the laundry was, this is where the patients were, and up in the top in the dome was the operating theater, the surgical theater at that point. And as you can see, it was close to the water, and patients actually came by boat, which is probably more comfortable than coming in a carriage over the cobblestones, which if you know them up by Lewisburg Square or other places, so you know how bad that would have been if you were a patient at that point. So that's an image of what the hospital looked like in about 1823 when it opened. Now here's a later view when the wings had been added on because it expanded rather quickly. And this is a view in 1850, and I want to show this to you as well because there across the way, which is Lechmere, is the asylum. Because when Mass General was founded, it was founded for the distressed of mind and body. It was meant for all ailments, and there was an asylum built. It was actually, they bought an old estate that Bulfinch designed, and then they added buildings to it, and it was an asylum for people who were mentally disturbed. So they took care of both. If we can split them now, we don't usually split them, so they called them lunatics, I have to tell you at that point. But they were cared for over across the river in a very benevolent way, a very advanced way, and in fact, the asylum made money. The wealthy people in Boston would put their mentally disturbed relatives in the asylum, and they paid for it. And that money was used to fund the free beds in Mass General Hospital, because remember, Mass General was for the indigent. So doctors treated patients here for no pay, and patients could stay here at no expense to their families. So here's a close-up of the asylum, a rather fanciful one, but there are descriptions of how bucolic it was and how well the patients were treated there. Well, it became an industrial site incrementally, so that by the 1850s, the railroad, which the train you can see on the left there is probably metaphorically entering the picture here, and as more and more railroad yards were built there, they decided it was an inappropriate place for this hospital to be, and it was about that point when a man named McLean gave enough money that it was renamed for him, and it was then moved to Belmont. But Mass General still has an association with that hospital in Belmont, although it's quite loose at this point. But it was founded originally as part of Mass General Hospital. Here's a model of what the hospital looked like in its neighborhood. It's a rather fanciful model, but I like it because it was built by a man who worked in the Buildings and Grounds Department of Mass General, and he did it as a labor of love, and it's a wonderful evocation, let's say, of what the neighborhood might have looked like. I don't think he really knew what the neighborhood looked like, although he probably did some research, but you can see that that was the extent of the hospital, and it was a very grand building among brick buildings that were part of what was the old aspects of colonial Boston. And again, you can see it's right on the edge of the river. So here's a later view taken from up on Beacon Hill, perhaps from the State House. And the one thing I would point out to you, if I can find the pointer, is that building, which is Harvard Medical School. So at that point, Harvard Medical School was adjacent to Mass General Hospital. It was built as the teaching hospital for Mass General. For Harvard Medical School. And so it was at that point very convenient for doctors to hold lectures at Mass General and then for them to take their students over to the hospital, because there was that pedagogical aspect that's the same as is used today in teaching hospitals, although everything else about the education was very different in terms of the protocols, in terms of course, what they knew. It didn't take as long to become a doctor at that point. There was no official licensing, so it was a very different kind of education than doctors have now. But nevertheless, Harvard Medical School was that close to the hospital at that point, and then in the late 19th century, it moved to the Fenway, but still remains closely affiliated with the hospital as a teaching hospital. Okay, and here we're zooming up into the future so you can see the campus as it exists. That was a few years ago, but it's pretty close. The museum is not here yet, and it will be, when it's built, it's right there. I'll switch to one more view while I've only, let's see, that's why that's not working. Okay, so a little farther out, and I'll just give you, so I zoom from the 1850s all the way up to the present, because we don't have time to talk about the rest right now. But what I want to tell you is some statistics about this hospital at this point. There are 25,000 employees of Mass General. On any one day, there are about 35,000 people on campus. This is literally a medical city. And everything that's in a city pretty much is within this hospital. Every kind of service, every kind of function is there. It is that large an institution, although it's on a relatively small piece of land. There are still about 900, not still, but there are 900 beds in the hospital, more or less. Visits to outpatient clinics, meaning not admitted to the hospital, about 1 million people a year. About 40,000 operations a year, surgical procedures a year, about 4,000 births a year at this place. And I should point out, because it's something a lot of people don't know, that it is really a biomedical research center. It's an engine of development, and it's a very important aspect of this hospital and of teaching hospitals in general, which make it different from other hospitals. And the research budget alone at Mass General is $600 million a year. That's the biggest research budget of any hospital in the United States. So research plays a very important part in the culture of this hospital. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as I go on with my explanations. Okay, so what is this museum itself? When I came to Mass General about 1.5 years ago, I had to become a fast learner because my job was to conceptualize what this museum would be, and I, of course, did this with a lot of people who had been thinking a lot about this for a long time. And I performed, I performed, I guess, what I'll call a little grammatical algebra. These two aphorisms, I think, were significant to me in general, and for a place like Mass General that's 200 years old and has a very rich history and culture. And the first is Philip Johnson's comment that you cannot not know history. And I think what he means by that is if you are an educated person or wish to be an educated person, you have to know history or you can't understand your culture. And then another comment by P.L. Travers, who wrote Mary Poppins. And she said, I see my childhood beside me rather than behind me. And I was always struck by that comment once I had read it. And so I combined these two into, that is, there, okay. History beside us rather than behind us. Because I think at a place like Mass General, once you understand about the history, then it really becomes palpable. And it really becomes part of what people understand their role to be at an institution like this. So I started thinking about how will a museum represent this kind of sensibility of history being beside us rather than behind us. I guess I really have to aim it better. And so you might think that this is going to be a treasure house because we have a lot of treasures. We have portraits and models and photographs and paintings and a quackery machine, that's the thing in the middle. We have all of those things, and they are wonderful things, but the point of this museum is not to celebrate those things in and of themselves, but it's to use them as ways into stories about the history and culture of this hospital and how Mass General played a seminal role in the evolution of medicine and clinical practice in the United States and in the world. So we are using them as ways into these stories because they are fascinating. They have fascinating tales to tell. And one, oops, well, I'm going to see if I can go back there. Yep. There are two themes that I use, or we use now when we've developed the exhibits that are kind of overarching themes that we want to emphasize. And one is about innovation at this hospital. Over 200 years, it's been an innovative place primarily. There are times when it's been hidebound, there are times when it's been conservative, but there is a streak of Mass General at its best being innovative. And I can illustrate it in a lot of different ways, and I'm going to illustrate it right now just by looking at two buildings. The first building, which is the 1823 Bullfinch building, and the most recent building that's been completed, well, not counting the museum, which is the Lunder building, which is the newest clinical building at the hospital, about a $500 million building that combines the emergency department, surgery suites, the most up-to-date surgery suites that we could imagine, and patient rooms. And the point of this is that, oops, sorry, I'm going too fast here, that both of these buildings, the Bulfinch building was as modern for its day as the Lunder building is today. It's hard for us to see that unless we know a little bit more about history. And the reality is that that building, other than the State House, was one of the biggest buildings in Boston when it was built. It was one of the grandest buildings, and it was in a new style. It was in the Greek Revival style. And remember that model that had all the brick little buildings around it? So this was a granite building using very large granite blocks and new technology of how to quarry granite, cut it into those blocks, get it to the site, and build a rather severe building. The Greek Revival style was meant to reflect Greek democracy, because that was what Americans believed they had founded, was a democracy unlike any other, except going back to Greece. So the fact that they wanted a hospital or public buildings to reflect that style was a revolution in style. I don't think it was as radical as our seeing a Frank Gehry building, but if you think about what the brick buildings look like, they look nothing like this. So that was a very modern building, whereas we think of it as an antique building. The other point is that it had the latest technology in it. It was built with new technology, and that chimney, which Bulfinch was criticized for as being awkward and ugly, was because there were within the Bulfinch building ducted heating systems. We don't know too much about them, but the building was not just heated with fireplaces or Franklin stoves. And I've also found receipts for water closets that were imported from England, and those receipts are from 1823. So remember, this building was for people who couldn't afford to pay for care at all. And they put into it the most modern devices they could manage. And they spent a lot of money on this building at that point, and they wanted to make a statement about what this meant to the city of Boston. So the Lunder building, of course, has the most modern, up-to-date infrastructure. That's a BIM drawing, as it's called, showing the guts of the building, which are phenomenal. And to those of us who watch the engineers design these, amazing that anybody can thread these things through the building. But that's the kind of support that we need, of course, now to support the procedures that are done in a modern building. But for their time, they're equally innovative. And that's the point, that there's a trajectory through history of innovation that we can look at. And we can look at it in the buildings, we can look at it in the procedures, we can look at it in the instruments that were developed at Mass General Hospital to change the way that medicine was practiced. Sorry. And then secondly is collaboration, because a lot of times, mostly, innovation happens through collaboration. Usually people don't know enough beyond their field to actually do anything very innovative unless they collaborate with people that have a different point of view. And that's often, in many instances, when innovation happens, is when you cross boundaries. And I can illustrate that by looking at one of the early famous operations, and that is the first time that in the United States publicly, we have to use a few qualifiers here, ether was used during a surgical operation. And that happened in 1846. John Collins Warden, one of the founders of Mass General, by this time almost at the end of his career, he was 68 at this point, was willing to listen to a dentist who had a formulation, which was ether, that he claimed could desensitize, make a person insensible to pain. Remember, at this point, there was no anesthesia for operations, so that any operation done was done by strapping the patient down, holding the patient down, and just proceeding. So the skill of a surgeon had to do only with speed. And John Collins Warren was said to be able to amputate a limb in 2 minutes. But it must have been horrific for people to go through those procedures. They did cataract surgery without anesthesia, and what that was is they poked a needle through your eye, and they caught the cloudy lens on that and pushed it in, and then it was broken up, and so you had a lot of floaters. But that was how they took care of a cataract. And people went back and had the second one done, which seems unbelievable to me that they would do that. But so surgery was terrible itself, and it was avoided at all costs. And it was also avoided because the aftermath of surgery was often death, because they didn't understand anything about bacteria. So there were these two pieces that needed to be resolved before surgery could really be particularly effective, although they were able to do some things and people did survive surgery, but then many people didn't. It's said that the procedures were done up in the dome partly because of the light. There was a lunette there is still, and also because the screams of the people being operated on were as far away from the rest of the patients as possible. So they were carried up 3 flights of stairs, put in a chair, and strapped in. So when Morton, who was a dentist, and dentists were not regarded as part of the medical profession, they were regarded as businessmen, so somewhat shady, in fact. And the fact that he was willing to try this shows a kind of spirit of, again, collaboration and willingness to try new things that was a character of many aspects of Mass General back then as it is now. And this picture over here is of Jack Szostak, who won the Nobel Prize several years ago, and he has a research lab at Mass General Hospital, and he is surrounded by all his research associates because in this day and age, certainly nobody can know enough to make advances in biochemical research and what we call translational medicine, which means translating research into direct applications in medicine, and that's much of what Mass General does, although Szostak started with pond scum. That's where he began his explorations and ended up understanding a very important part about how the tails of DNA protect themselves with something called telomeres, but that's another story. So exhibits in the Russell Museum have this theme of innovation and collaboration, and we look at a trajectory across time. So the point is that the exhibits are as much about what's happening now in the hospital and what's going to happen in the future, or what we hope and believe is going to happen in the future, as it is about what happened in the past. So I'm going to take you very briefly through the conceptual idea of the exhibits. There's a ground floor, and this is the ground floor, and it's organized by kind of large themes about medicine and health. Not health so much. This is not a museum about don't smoke or be careful what you eat. This is about the kind of how do we know what's wrong, how do we know how to treat it, how do we understand what it means to be healthy or to be well, which is increasingly a kind of ecological sensibility about all the aspects that go into making someone well or feel well. So we use these larger themes, for instance, understanding disease. That's about diagnosis. How did people in the past figure out what was wrong? What are the tools that are used now besides a conversation, but what are the actual clinical tools that can be used now? And we are, of course, now looking at molecular structure and genetics, when we are looking at the origins and causes of disease, and they're increasingly individual, as you probably know, about what would affect me but not you. And that's the kind of things that people are starting to be able to diagnose at this point very specifically. So we look at this evolution of understanding what's wrong in this module, understanding disease. And then it goes on to taking aim, which is about the targeted therapy that we're now being able to do with specific cancers, and how successful some of these are, which is meaning taking pills, not getting radiation. The pills have no other side effects than just knocking out that cancer. That is where we are with lung cancer, certain kinds of lung cancer. It's an amazing transformation that will happen over, of course, we don't know how many years, but it is already happening for certain patients where they have no side effects from their treatments, which is pretty, other than the tumors begin to disappear. So we will look at that kind of therapy that happens at Mass General at this point. There are other aspects which I'm not going to go into, but the idea is that as new discoveries are made, we can change the pieces that illustrate the story. So this museum needs to keep up with the changes in medicine, and we will do it by being able to pull out the pieces and change how we give examples for each of these areas of interest. I'm going to show you. Okay, here is a bird's eye view of the exhibit floor, just so you get some sense of what it's going to look like. I shouldn't say might, because it's being built. And I'm just going to show you something about the introductory exhibit, which is kind of setting the scene for Mass General's culture. And it harks back, in a way, it harks back to the beginning of the hospital. We explain a little bit about Bartlett and Warren and Collins. And then we address this issue of who is our neighbor, because one of the characteristics of Mass General has been that when there are events in the world that call for medical professionals to render service, Mass General has often sent teams of people there. So the understanding of who is our neighbor extended from the hospital, when they meant really in this immediate neighborhood, to actually the whole world at this point. And it is one of the characteristics, again, of a hospital with the resources like Mass General has, and the people who are there who want to do this, that in fact Mass General clinicians work all over the world. So this first exhibit, this is an early version of it, where we have a large picture frame that's juxtaposed against old objects from the earliest part of Mass General, and the two founders, their busts, are looking at this video frame, because the video frame is showing the evolution of understanding of who is our neighbor. And that was supposed to change, but it didn't, so never mind. So here again is the, or not again, but this is the interior of the museum. This was a few months ago, and here's what it looks like. That was about a month ago, and here is a rendering of what that initial exhibit is going to look like. So right in the foreground, you'll see a model of the Bullfinch building and a panel with an explanation of why the hospital was founded. The busts of the founders are looking at what's a large video screen of Mass General folks working around the world. And we actually have built this one already because we set it up for a bicentennial dinner for Mass General. And so you can see how it's playing out, and that is a large video screen there that they're looking at. And then beyond that, I want to point out this juxtaposition of these old objects from the hospital, some plates from 1825, an amputation kit from about 1830 over here on this side. And on the far side is an incubator that's made out of car parts. And it was developed at Mass General for third world use, because people realized that when incubators for babies and children are donated to third world countries, they're nice when they get them, but they can't repair them when they break because they have too many sophisticated parts in them. So one of the researchers at Mass General said, what if we make an incubator out of car parts? Because Toyota is about the most common vehicle in the world, and most everybody in the world can repair a Toyota. So they took the car parts from the Toyota, they worked with a very good design firm and made that incubator that's over there. So that's a kind of illustration of innovation and collaboration, again, thinking outside of the own boundaries of your discipline to figure out what we can do better or what we can do next. So again, this exhibit in a nutshell is showing a kind of trajectory across 200 years. And of course, in some ways, it is showing Mass General at its best. That's part of the point of the museum. But nevertheless, I think this encapsulates the culture of the place that we want staff members to understand and realize that they're part of this. Second floor is meant to be much more open and flexible because we want to use it for programs, for lectures, for conversations, for receptions, for parties, for temporary exhibits, and we'll have on the far end a sort of lounge space. So in some ways it's kind of a clubhouse for the museum, but I mean a clubhouse for the hospital, but I also mean it to be used by the community. So the intent is that this will be open to everyone. In fact, the museum has no admission charge. It will be open to everyone for free. And so that is the second floor, and we'll develop changing exhibits on that floor. Here's an example of an exhibit we might develop, and it can be about the evolution of imaging, medical imaging, over about 150 years. In 1857, Mass General appointed the first medical artist at the hospital to illustrate the patient cases. And at Harvard Countway, we found these illustrations from, oh, I'm sorry, I don't have his name here. His name is Manlius Sargent. And they were part of the patient's records. The one on the right is his illustration of a brain. What he understood a brain to be. So we can show those. And then Mass General had a school of medical illustration at the hospital in the 1940s and 1950s, and they were doing black and white illustrations at that point because they were used in publications, and publications at that point only printed in black and white. So they had to become very skilled at illustrating very complicated aspects of bodies using only tonal capabilities, and they are very beautiful drawings, I must say. And then I'm showing one here of the kind of imaging that goes on now, and that's not a drawing, that's the actual inside of a body from a scan. And so the capabilities of imaging, both for diagnostic use, which is what these were, and teaching use, but also for treatment, because imaging is about energy at this point, and now it's about how much energy and how targeted it is, so that you can actually treat with the same kind of energy that you use to illustrate. So we can have an exhibit like this on the second floor, in this case using only things from Mass General to look at this trajectory of the evolution of imaging in medicine. There's a rooftop garden that's there as well, and I can show you its evolution. This is a few months ago before the plants had lost their leaves, and then they, very shortly after they were planted, went into their winter mode. But again, this will just be part of the museum that's open to everyone who comes. So the idea of a museum is, let's say, as broad as we can imagine making it. What does it mean? What does a museum mean? And we want it to have this kind of sense of welcome to it and a kind of sense of expansiveness to it that goes beyond what people sometimes think of as fusty old museums. This is just statistics about how many people we can accommodate for different kinds of events. And we are collaborating with Proto Magazine, which is a really interesting medical magazine that is free. You can subscribe by going to proto.com, P-R-O-T-O.com. It's a quarterly magazine that's put out in a collaboration between Mass General and Time, Inc. And it is about the current state of research and application and where we are headed. And it's a really interesting magazine. I'd recommend you sign up for it. But we're going to collaborate with Proto in the future on topics for the changing exhibits and topics for programs. So it might be about any one of these things because they cover things like this in that magazine. Let's see. Distributed museum is the idea that the museum's not contained in that one building, that the museum can be any place on the hospital campus where there's something interesting or where there's nothing interesting, because we can provide some interest. So we're starting to map out an idea of how we will extend this sense of explaining the culture and history of Mass General in many places in the hospital. And this, again, this display is a new one that we just opened at the edge of the Lunder building. It's a long but narrow set of display cases which are the museums to develop. And this was done in time for what we call Ether Day at Mass General, which is October 16th, the day when they first used ether. And it is an exploration of the discovery of ether using objects from our archives to illustrate the evolution of anesthesia in the United States. Have to go that way. So I want to just return to that statement I showed you at the beginning, history beside us rather than behind us, because as we developed the museum, it became clear that there was something a little more about what this museum could do, and we hope it can do, than just making people a little more aware of the history of the place. And that's illustrated by this desk. It's a desk that now is in the president's office. It's a 19th century desk, and what's interesting about it is that when residents came to Mass General, they signed it. They signed the interior. You flip up the top, and they signed on. In effect, that's the point. They signed on. And I believe that it's emblematic of the commitment of the people who have worked for Mass General for many years, that they knew they were signing up for carrying on the traditions of this institution. And I believe that in many ways, the museum can make this palpable for the staff members, because I think it is important. We think it is important for people who work at Mass General to understand the culture of this place. And in some ways, we want the museum to be this place where we can make known to them the tradition, the roles, and the fact that it's now our turn, not just the clinicians, but everyone's turn to carry on, to support the work of an amazing institution like Mass General. There are other amazing hospitals as well, but the more you know about this evolution and the commitment of these people to making life better for everyone, I think the more we can understand the importance of that hospitals play in our culture. So I hope you will come and see us when we open, which will be in February, to the public. We're starting to have smaller openings for donors and things like that. In fact, we have one in 2 weeks. That's a rendering of the museum, and here is a photograph that was taken just a few weeks ago of what the museum looks like now, in case you haven't been over to see it. I will say a word about the fact that it's a copper facade, that is copper, and it will patinate, is the verb, to that kind of blue-green color over about 25 years, and incrementally it goes through different states then. We chose that material. It was chosen by the architects because it's a very long, solid, long-lived material. The Quincy Dome was replaced after about, 120 years was when they had to replace the copper, so it lasts a long time. And it also harkens back to the use of copper throughout Boston's history, and the Bulfinch building as well has a copper dome, so that there are echoes in this building. It's again juxtaposing a very contemporary building, as you can see, with an old material, and also next door is the resident physician's house. That's, let's see, this house. That's where the doctor used to live who had to see every patient that was going to be admitted to the hospital. That's going to become the archival library and offices for the museum. So again, we're juxtaposing the past and the present right next to each other. And it is that sensibility about Mass General of history being palpable, important, and a tradition that it is ours to carry on. So I thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Nothing? Okay. Now, Webster Bull, let's see if I have a black slide after this. Well, maybe we should just leave it. Okay. So I'm going to turn over the spot here to Webster Bull, my colleague and friend, and he's going to tell you about this book he wrote. He was able to include a lot more than a museum can ever include. A museum can't be a book. So it was a wonderful opportunity for both of us to be able to do a book and a museum. So here's Webster.
Well, it's true that a book can include much more than a museum, but I just heard more in the last hour or 40 minutes than I remember from having written this book. So you'll have to forgive me, but you know, the question arises, why did I write this book, and what was my experience encountering this hospital? So Peter has shown you some wonderful visuals of the hospital and its history, as the museum does. I think what I can offer you is a unique perspective on truly an outsider coming into this institution with this great reputation, great position in the city of Boston. What was my experience? Well, first of all, why me? I'm still asking that question after 4 years, but if I look at my childhood as being beside me rather than behind me, which was the P.L. Travers quote, what I see beside me is a piping hot bowl of cream of wheat. Because my grandfather ran the cream of wheat company in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And when he was done, he retired and my grandmother had died, he sat down to an old typewriter and banged out his life story. 30 pages, single-spaced. I'm going to get in the picture here, but give you a little variety here from a different angle. He simply made 10 Xerox copies of this thing and sent it around to his children and grandchildren. And he only had 10 on that list. Well, for some reason, this manuscript, which he created in 1965 when I was 14, I kept until 1985 when I was 34. And I was in a position in my life where I was doing a lot of writing for another purpose. I was just about to get married. I was thinking I wanted to expand my horizons, and I thought of my grandfather. I thought, if Granddad had wanted to write his life story when he was 75-ish, perhaps there would be other people out there in the world who would like to commit their life story to print and publish it in a nice little book for their family. And so I created a company called Memoirs Unlimited with a very specific purpose of finding people who are interested in writing their life stories and publishing them privately, not becoming famous, not getting on the bestseller list, but simply a book for one's family, for your Christmas card list, for the people closest to you in the world. And so I did that. And I did that for a number of years, and I've done over 50 or 60 individual books that way. But along the way, I became acquainted with people who would say to me, I don't want my own life story done, I want the story of my family written as a history, or I want the story of my family business as a history. And since I was in Boston, and I was meeting Boston families, and generally they were Boston families of means. There's no way around that because there were people who were willing to pay my fees. I started to encounter families like the Cabots, great Boston family, and a corporation called Cabot Corporation, which had been founded by a guy named Godfrey L. Cabot, and I wrote the history of that company. So I started to get involved with Boston stories, both as and let's call it a private ghostwriter of memoirs, or a ghostwriter of private memoirs, or as a local historian. Meanwhile, I started a publishing company with my wife called Commonwealth Editions, which published also local books about Boston, some of which are still on sale at the bookstore. I no longer own Commonwealth Editions. We sold it last year, but the imprint still exists. So 4 or 5 years ago, when Mass General was considering doing its history, they decided they were not going to look for a medical writer, a scientific writer, or an academic writer, fortunately for me, because I'm none of the above. They wanted somebody who would capture the spirit of the place, who would somehow find a way of mimicking the voice of this place and tell its story in narrative form. And when they encountered me among a series of people who wanted the job, and I told them my experience of interviewing many, many Boston people about their experiences, I think this resonated with them. And they told me, well, this would be great, because we think you're probably going to have to interview at least 24 people for this book, and we would like to really hear their voice talking about Mass General. Well, in the end, and this is part of my encounter with Mass General after I got the job, it wasn't 24 people. It was more like 10 people. I interviewed 120 doctors, nurses, trustees, employees of all kinds of the hospital, and tried to integrate their voices, their male and female voices from all walks of life, into the history of this hospital, which is also a documentary history. I had the very good fortune of doing this book with my daughter. When you buy the book after my brilliant lecture, as I'm sure you will buy the book, you'll find that there's 2 names on the front, Webster Bull and Martha Bull. Martha Bull is not my wife. She is my daughter. She wrote actually much of the first 2 chapters, which cover the 19th century, doing it largely from documentary sources. This allowed me to concentrate on the 20th century, a lot more interviewing and integration of living voices into the story. So what was it like going to this place where I knew nothing about medicine or science or had no real connections? I just happened to have the resume that resonated with the search committee. I mean, that's the truth. I had no I'm not a Harvard guy. So what was my experience? Well, I first met with a book committee. And I figured, well, this is great. I'm going to be reporting to a small committee of people, a couple of wonderful women who work in the public relations office. Peggy Slazeman, Lynn Dale were working in that office, and then a couple of wonderful senior doctors, including Paul Russell, for whom the museum is named, who has a great love of the history of the place, which I think is one reason he's honored with his name on the museum. And I figured, well, this is going to be easy. I'll just report to this one committee, and every once in a while I'll send them a manuscript. Well, it didn't work out quite that way. As I was moving from 24 interview subjects to 120 interview subjects, and everyone around the hospital began to sniff that there was a project going on, every single chief of any kind of clinical or scientific service within the hospital wanted, of course, his or her story told. And I moved from reporting to one committee to reporting to 25 different bosses. And I was posed the problem in medias res, while the project was going on, very early on, it's like, okay, wait a minute. What we really want is not just a narrative history of the hospital. We want a narrative history of the hospital with the stories of all these individual services plugged into it at various meaningful points along the way. So somehow I had to find a way of telling the story of anesthesiology, of cardiology, of transplantation surgery, of molecular biology. And all these stories had to somehow fit into this matrix of a 200-year history. So I had to be light on my feet. I think we came up with an elegant solution for that. And just as Peter showed you the design of the museum, the design of the book is that you begin in Boston in 1811 or before, at the time of the Revolution. You move along toward Ether Day, 1846. You tell the story of Ether Day. And of course, the great discipline that's exhibited at Ether Day is anesthesia, anesthesiology. So you tell that story, and then you take off from there. And in the course of 10 or 15 pages, you tell the entire arc of the history of anesthesiology at Mass General from 1846 to the present day. And then back to 1846, continue along, and then there's perhaps something, well, late in the century, we develop the X-ray. And you have this wonderful story, which I'm sure is illustrated in the museum, of Walter Dodd, who's considered the martyr of radiology at Mass General, because he was not a doctor. He was the, well, he was a photographer, so he's involved in, again, imaging, early crude imaging. He was the hospital photographer, and he heard about this X-ray technology being developed over in Germany, and he literally built his own X-ray machine, because they didn't, you know, you didn't have a Raytheon making X-ray machines and turning them out at that time. You had to understand the technology and build your own machine in your own little workshop under the stairs of the Bullfinch building or wherever it was. And then he experimented on himself. And there is a picture that we have of Walter Dodd putting his arm under the X-ray machine. And just, I mean, it's a still photograph, so we don't know how long he held it there. But the understanding at the time was that you turned the machine on, you put your arm under, and once your skin began to glow, then you knew that the machine was ready to take an image. So it may not surprise you that Walter Dodd developed skin cancer or bone, I'm not sure what particular kind of cancer, but he submitted to some ungodly number of amputations and procedures in the last 10 or 15 years of his life, I think eventually losing one of his entire arms, and died a martyr to the X-ray, as we say. So you encounter these wonderful stories along the way. But what was it like working with these people at Mass General? You know, it could be very intimidating, because again, I wasn't a Harvard guy, I don't know the secret handshakes, I don't know the language. Okay, so I'm walking in there, my daughter's walking in there, and how are we treated? You know, what's it like to encounter this culture? Well, you know what? It was really cool. It was really great. Because you know, anybody who saw me coming around with my recorder wanted to get their story told well, so they were nice to me. That's understandable. But at the same time, you're dealing with brilliant people, just a few of whom have medium-sized egos. And so you're dealing with very powerful, very bright people. And what I discovered about Mass General that was really, really striking is that you do have this extraordinary, the highest level of medical and scientific talent, men and women. And yet they are all harnessed to a common mission. This notion of every man our neighbor that Peter explained so well, you know, really does run through, you know, the history of the hospital. Sure, every patient is a source of fees too for every doctor, but every man is our neighbor. And you don't, in fact, my book ends because it was my choice, okay? So this is another thing about the wonderful encounter with this organization. And I'll come back to every man our neighbor in just a second. And I'm going to close fairly quickly because you've been sitting a long time. But I was given free rein. I was not micromanaged by this powerful organization, the largest civilian employer in Massachusetts. I was really you know. Now, I guess I'm not a dumb ox, okay? I'm a bull, so I'm a relatively smart bull. But, you know, so they didn't just let anybody do this, but nevertheless, they said, okay, go and do this book and report back to us once in a while. And there was, yes, this is a subsidized history of the hospital, but it was remarkable the extent to which the hospital let me tell it in my own voice and in my daughter's voice. And so when it came time to deciding, well, who is going to get the pride of place of being sort of the closing chapter of this story? Where do you end? Do you end with Jack Szostak winning the Nobel Prize, which is a remarkable story? And there's another guy, Gary Ruvkin, who they say is maybe lined up for a Nobel at some point because he's already won the Lasker Award. Sure, you could end with that. Do you end with the current leadership of the hospital? Well, I decided to end with three people: Tom Durant, Susan Briggs, and the guy who really won my heart was Jim O'Connell. These are three people who... Well, thank you. Okay, so you agree with me? Okay, so Jim O'Connell ends the book. Why does he end the book? Because Jim O'Connell, 25 years ago, was a young resident, not so young actually, he went to medical school at the age of 30, so he was probably in his mid to late 30s. He was asked to start a pioneer program of health care for the homeless in the city of Boston, with basically one nurse, one shrink, and a truck. And I don't even think they had a truck at the beginning. So the job was to go around the city looking for people under bridges, in abandoned cars, and care for them. Now, there was city funding and federal funding, I'm sure, behind this, and it was not done purely for altruistic reasons. I mean, it was a beautiful thing, a beautiful program for the hospital to take the lead on. And yet, if you meet Jim O'Connell today, he absolutely exemplifies the spirit of the founders of the hospital. Every man is our neighbor. He's my age, which, you know, is around 60 years of age, or maybe, I don't know, you know, he's probably much younger, but anyway, he and I are pretty much contemporaries. And we did hit it off. I mean, I went and I spent time with him, as I did with many people, at his office, walked around this wonderful old converted mortuary in the South End that is now the building where they have a 104-bed respite care center where they take people who are too sick to be on the streets, but not so sick that they need to be admitted to a general hospital, and they give them this sort of intermediate care until they're ready to go back on the streets. And I'll end with this, because I need to end. You know, I was really struck by Jim O'Connell. Tom Durant, by the way, did all kinds of refugee medicine. Susan Briggs is an incredible trauma surgeon who's gone all around the world and taken care of people in Haiti after the earthquake, et cetera. She was at Ground Zero. She basically led the emergency surgical operations at Ground Zero after 9/11. I mean, she's a towering character. But I ended with Jim O'Connell because there were certain things about him that struck me, and the thing that finally struck me was I said to him, Jim, isn't it frustrating when you know you're going to take this, for lack of a better word, drug-abusing, alcoholic, schizophrenic person off the street? And that is not to categorize all those people as that, but you're dealing with a lot of that. You're dealing with a lot of mental disability and a lot of substance abuse. And you're going to take them into your hospital, and you're going to care for them, and then you're going to let them go home, which is back on the street. And what do you think when you realize most of these people are going to relapse? They're just going to get in trouble again 3 days later. What do you do? He said, well, just about everybody who comes and works with me or works in this program goes through that. And almost everybody gets politicized within a month. The system is terrible. We've got to do something for the homeless. We've got to solve these problems. This is not doing any good. The people who stay eventually drop all that politics and just say, I'm a doctor, you're my patient, I'm taking care of you. And it's very beautiful. And there are a lot of really remarkable beautiful, fascinating, brilliant, egotistical, and not so people working at Mass General, and it was my great honor as a total medical ignoramus to encounter them for 3 years and write this book. And I hope some of what they've done has gotten into it. Thank you very much. Questions?
Thank you both. If anybody has any questions, back there. Hold on, I'm coming. Just hold the mic up right to your mouth.
The folks that you helped, the homeless indigent that came into the hospital, did they seem grateful for what they were getting? Did they understand the help they were getting? And also, did they ever do any follow-up with the folks, like 6 months, a year later, how they were doing? Did they
That's a
maybe
good question. Well,
realize, get off the street, and maybe make something of myself, that sort of thing?
I might not have been clear. I am not a doctor, and I did not treat the homeless. I only encountered Jim O'Connell as an interviewer trying to understand what he was doing with the homeless. I think there's eternal follow-up in the program. I mean, I think that there's a determination to stick with these patients until they no longer need care. And that's part of the ethos, part of the culture of the place. My own follow-up is interesting. I was so fascinated with this program, and with my background in memoir, I thought, wouldn't it be cool to do a book of essentially memoiristic or personal accounts of homeless people and their experience. And I started pitching Jim O'Connell on this idea because I thought, I'd like to get some funding for it, and he'd probably be able to help me get some funding for it. He basically told me that he's already working on it. So I thought he's much better off for that kind of book. So maybe one of these days you'll find that James J. O'Connell has done a book of accounts of the experience of homeless people.
I understand, and I'm not sure which one of you should answer this, that you used to be able to get a tour of the Ether Dome in that Bullfinch building. Can you still do that?
Are you turned on?
I think I'm turned on. Okay. Not right now is the answer, but the museum will begin sponsoring tours once the museum is open and in operation. So try back again in March or April. Yep.